Chapter 1. The Shadow of Guilt. Part 1. The Burden of Thought. In the dimly lit streets of St. Petersburg, where the air carried a strange mix of hope and despair, a young man named Raskolnikov walked with a heavy heart. His mind was a battlefield of thoughts, some rational, some chaotic, yet all leading him down a path he feared to acknowledge. The world around him felt distant, almost unreal, as if he were an outsider in his own existence. Raskolnikov, a former student struggling with poverty, had grown weary of the relentless suffering that life imposed upon him. He had once been full of ambition, but now he found himself trapped in a cycle of desperation. The idea had taken root in his mind, an idea so unsettling that he wrestled with it at every step. Was it possible that crime could be justified? Could punishment be avoided if one acted with higher reasoning? As he made his way through the crowded streets, his thoughts wove a complex web of morality and necessity. His destination was clear, yet his conscience wavered. Every step brought him closer to the moment of decision. The weight of his own contemplation pressed upon him, making even the simplest actions feel like a trial. The city pulsed with life. Carriages rolled past, merchants shouted their prices, and beggars clutched at the hems of passers-by. Yet, amidst this chaos, Raskolnikov felt alone. His crime had not yet been committed, but in his heart, he already sensed the punishment that would follow. Would he dare to cross the line between right and wrong? Or would the burden of his conscience hold him back? Part 2. A Mind in Turmoil. Raskolnikov's steps grew slower as he neared his small, cramped lodging. His thoughts, once a distant whisper, now roared like an unstoppable tide. The weight of his own reasoning pressed upon him, making his body feel heavier with every passing moment. He threw open the door to his tiny, dimly lit room. The walls, bare and lifeless, seemed to close in around him, suffocating him with their silence. The only furniture, a rickety table and a tattered bed, offered no comfort. He sank onto the bed, burying his face in his hands. The idea he had been entertaining was no longer just a passing thought. It had become an obsession. Could a man commit a crime without facing punishment? Could he justify it, not in the eyes of the law, but in the court of his own conscience? His mind argued both sides, like a ruthless trial playing out within him. One voice whispered that laws were meant for the weak, that great men had always defied the rules of society to shape history. Another voice, softer but persistent, asked, "But what of the cost? What of the weight that such an act would place upon your soul?" He stood suddenly, pacing the small room. The very walls seemed to judge him, reflecting his unease. He needed air, space, an escape from the suffocating intensity of his own thoughts. Grabbing his coat, he stepped out once more into the streets of St. Petersburg, where the night was alive with secrets and the weight of an uncommitted crime still loomed over him. Part 3. The Temptation of Fate. The cold night air hit Raskolnikov's face as he stepped onto the bustling streets of St. Petersburg. The city had a peculiar way of reflecting a man's inner turmoil. Its flickering lanterns and echoing footsteps felt like ghostly whispers, urging him toward an unknown fate. His feet moved without direction, carrying him through winding alleys and across dimly lit squares. He found himself near the Haymarket, where vendors were packing up their stalls, their voices a distant murmur against the sounds of the city. He paused for a moment, his gaze locking onto a familiar sight, a small pawn shop tucked between two larger buildings. The old woman who ran the shop, Alyona Ivanovna, was a miserly pawnbroker, known for preying on the desperation of the poor. Raskolnikov had visited her before, exchanging his few belongings for meager sums. He despised her greed, her cold and calculating eyes that measured a man's worth in kopecks. She does nothing but hoard wealth at the expense of the suffering, he thought. A dangerous idea crept into his mind, wrapping itself around his thoughts like an inescapable chain. What if he could rid the world of her? What if, in one swift act, he could erase her cruelty and claim her riches to free himself from poverty? Would that not be a crime justified by reason? He clenched his fists, shaking his head as if to drive the thought away. But it did not leave. It stayed, lingering like a shadow, tempting him with the promise of freedom. For the first time, the line between crime and punishment blurred. Would he dare cross it? Part 4. The Justification of a Crime. Raskolnikov turned away from the pawn shop, his breath shallow, his thoughts racing. He had never felt so alive, nor so trapped. The idea that had taken root in his mind was no longer just a thought. It was beginning to feel like an inevitability. He wandered aimlessly through the streets, reasoning with himself, trying to frame his growing desire into something logical, something necessary. Was it really a crime if it served a greater purpose? He thought of all the people who suffered in silence, struggling under the weight of poverty, while people like Alyona Ivanovna hoarded wealth they did not need. He had read about great men, Napoleon, Caesar, who had defied the laws of morality and emerged victorious. Were they punished for their crimes? Or were they celebrated for their strength, for their willingness to act? If I take action, am I not just stepping into my own destiny? He whispered to himself. But then came the doubt, creeping in like a cold wind. He imagined standing over the old woman, weapon in hand. Would he have the courage to strike? Would his hands shake? And what of the punishment? Not the law. He had little fear of that. But the punishment of his own mind. Would his conscience allow him to live in peace? A sudden wave of exhaustion washed over him. He hadn't eaten properly in days. His head throbbed with the weight of his thoughts. He needed rest, if only for a moment, before the storm within him became too strong to bear. With slow, heavy steps, he made his way back to his room, where darkness awaited him, not just within the walls, but within himself. Part 5. A Dream of Blood. Sleep did not come easily to Raskolnikov. His body ached with fatigue, but his mind refused to rest. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts circling the same dark path. Crime, punishment, justice, guilt. The words had lost their meaning, blending into a tangled mess of logic and fear. At some point, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted into a restless sleep. But the moment his eyes closed, he was plunged into a dream, one so vivid, so terrifying, that it gripped him with the force of reality. He was a child again, walking with his father through the countryside. The air was fresh, the fields golden under the sun. But soon, the peaceful scene darkened. In the distance, a group of drunken men stood laughing near an old, frail horse. The horse, tied to a cart too heavy for its weak frame, struggled under the weight. The men, cruel and impatient, began to beat it mercilessly, their laughter growing louder with each blow. Raskolnikov screamed, begged them to stop, but no one listened. The horse's eyes were wide with terror, its legs trembling. One final strike, and it collapsed, lifeless on the dirt. A sharp cry escaped Raskolnikov's lips, and he jolted awake, drenched in sweat. His heart pounded in his chest. The dream was not about the horse. It was about him, about what he was planning to do. He sat up, his breathing ragged. His mind raced, trying to understand what it all meant. Was it a warning? A message from his conscience? Or was it simply fear, manifesting in his sleep? The early morning light crept through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. He pressed his hands to his temples, trying to calm the storm within him. One thing was certain: he could not escape his own thoughts. The crime had not yet been committed, but the punishment had already begun. Chapter 2. The Edge of Decision. Part 1. The Weight of the Future. The morning sun filtered weakly through Raskolnikov's window, casting pale streaks of light onto the wooden floor. The room felt colder than usual, as if the dream from the night before had left a lingering chill in the air. He sat motionless on his bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, his body weighed down by a fatigue that went beyond mere sleeplessness. The dream haunted him. It was not just a dream. It was a warning, a glimpse into the horror of what he was contemplating. Yet, the idea still clung to him, refusing to be shaken off. He told himself it was foolish to dwell on nightmares. They were nothing more than the mind playing tricks. But deep down, he knew better. He rose to his feet unsteadily, pressing his fingers against his temples. This indecision, this back and forth, he could not go on like this. Either he abandoned the thought altogether, or he carried it through to the end. But how could he abandon it now? Poverty pressed on him like an iron weight. His landlady was growing impatient with his unpaid rent. His clothes were growing shabbier by the day. His boots were worn thin. His mind, once sharp and full of ambition, was now dulled by hunger and hopelessness. He reached for his coat and stepped outside, hoping the movement, the city's noise, and the presence of others would drive away the tormenting thoughts. But as soon as he stepped onto the street, the world around him felt different, almost distant, as if he were seeing it through a veil. With every step, his purpose became clearer. Whether it was fate or madness, he was being pulled toward an irreversible decision. Would he resist it, or would he surrender to the weight of his own destiny? Part 2. A Test of Courage. Raskolnikov walked through the streets of St. Petersburg, his hands clenched tightly in his coat pockets. The city was alive with movement, carriages rattling over cobblestone streets, merchants shouting their prices, beggars pleading for alms. But to him, it all felt muted, distant, like a world he no longer belonged to. His mind was consumed by a single thought. Was he truly capable of committing the act? He had spent days, weeks, justifying it, crafting arguments to silence his conscience. He had told himself that the old pawnbroker, Alyona Ivanovna, was nothing more than a parasite, a creature feeding off the misery of others. Her death would not be a crime. It would be a service to the world. And yet, doubt lingered. The dream from the night before still haunted him. The sight of the helpless horse being beaten to death had filled him with horror. Was it a sign? Was it proof that, no matter how much he reasoned with himself, he would not be able to go through with it? He turned a corner and, without thinking, found himself once again near the old pawnbroker's home. He stopped in his tracks, his breath catching. He had not planned to come here, and yet something had led him back. Should he go inside? Should he test himself? His heart pounded. If he was serious about his plan, he had to know if he could face her without fear. If he faltered now, then all his theories, all his justifications, would mean nothing. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and knocked on the door. The sound echoed in his ears like a hammer striking metal. Would he be able to follow through with his intentions, or would the mere sight of her shatter his resolve? Part 3. Face to face with fate. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit corridor. A sharp, familiar voice cut through the silence. "Who's there?" Alyona Ivanovna's suspicious tone reached Raskolnikov's ears before she even appeared. A moment later, the old pawnbroker stepped forward, her small, beady eyes peering at him with the same calculating greed he had always despised. Raskolnikov swallowed, steadying himself. "It's me. I brought something to pawn," he said, forcing his voice to sound natural. She eyed him warily before stepping aside, motioning him in. He entered the tiny, cluttered apartment, the air thick with the smell of old fabric and stale candle wax. His eyes darted to the wooden chest in the corner, the one where she kept her money, the one he had imagined breaking open 1,000 times in his mind. Alyona shuffled toward the small wooden table, adjusting her shawl. "What do you have?" she asked impatiently. Raskolnikov reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver cigarette case, one of the few possessions he had left. He placed it on the table and watched as the old woman picked it up with her bony fingers, examining it closely. "Not worth much," she muttered, setting it down. "I'll give you a ruble for it." A ruble? A miserable sum. His pulse quickened. This woman had wealth hidden away, yet she gave out coins like they were crumbs for starving dogs. His fingers twitched at his side. He had imagined this moment so many times. He could do it now. He could end her life and take what he needed. But as he stood there, face to face with the woman he had convinced himself deserved to die, something inside him wavered. Could he really go through with it? Could he truly take a life? His breath felt shallow. The room seemed to close in around him. He had to leave now. Snatching the ruble from the table, he turned on his heel and hurried out the door. As he stepped back onto the bustling streets, his heart pounded with a mixture of relief and frustration. He had been there, at the very edge of the act, yet he had hesitated. Was it fear that held him back? Or was it something deeper? Something within him that refused to cross that final line? Part 4. A Battle Within. Raskolnikov walked quickly, his mind in turmoil. The sounds of the city swirled around him. Carriages clattering, vendors calling out their prices, laughter spilling from tavern doors. But none of it reached him. His thoughts drowned out the world. He had been so close. The moment had been within his grasp, yet he had fled like a coward. Was this who he truly was? A man who could dream of great things, but lacked the courage to act? His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists. No, he told himself. It wasn't fear that stopped me. It was something else. Something I need to understand. He wandered aimlessly through the streets, barely aware of where he was going. His body moved on its own, carrying him through alleyways and past familiar corners until he found himself standing before a tavern. For a long moment, he hesitated. He rarely drank. His mind was too restless, too sharp for the dulling effects of alcohol. But tonight, he felt the need for something, anything, to quiet the raging storm inside him. Pushing open the door, he stepped inside. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of cheap vodka. Men sat hunched over wooden tables, their faces flushed, their voices loud and slurred. Raskolnikov made his way to an empty corner and sat down. He ordered a drink, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. As he took the first burning sip, a thought crept into his mind. Had he truly abandoned the idea? Or was this merely a pause, a brief moment of hesitation before he finally surrendered to what he knew must be done? His fingers tightened around the glass. Somewhere deep within him, he already knew the answer. Part 5. A Dangerous Encounter. Raskolnikov sat in the dimly lit tavern, his fingers tracing the rim of his half-empty glass. The bitter taste of vodka lingered on his tongue, but it did little to calm the storm within him. His thoughts churned, shifting between doubt and determination. Could he do it? Would he? His brooding was interrupted by the sound of a heavy sigh from the table beside him. He turned slightly and saw a man slumped over, his coat tattered, his face lined with sorrow. The man caught his gaze and gave a sad smile. "A student, eh?" the man slurred. "I was one once, too, before life crushed me." Raskolnikov said nothing. The man chuckled bitterly. "You look troubled, my friend. Let me tell you something. Life is full of suffering, but the ones who survive are those who take what they need. Waiting for justice? Foolishness. The strong make their own fate." Raskolnikov's pulse quickened. The words struck a chord within him, aligning with the very thoughts that had tormented him for weeks. "And what of punishment?" he asked quietly, staring into his glass. The man laughed, a hollow sound. "Punishment? It comes in many forms, my friend. The law? Easily escaped. But your own conscience? Ah, that is the true prison." He drained his drink and slammed the glass on the table. Raskolnikov felt a chill run through him. He had come here seeking escape, but instead, he had found something else. A voice that echoed his own thoughts, a reflection of the path he might take. He stood abruptly, throwing a few coins on the table. The man barely noticed, lost in his own misery. As Raskolnikov stepped outside, the night air hit him like a slap. The city still pulsed with life, indifferent to the battles waged within a man's soul. One thing was clear now: there was no running from his own mind. The decision was his to make, and soon, the moment would come. Would he seize his fate?